Good evening and welcome to PRIO and the Game of Thrones and Reality event. My name is Henrik Urdal and I'm the director of the Peace Research Institute Oslo, and I'm extremely happy to see so many of you turning out for this event. It is a product of a very fruitful collaboration between PRIO and the University of Oslo. We have a strategic collaboration agreement that involves developing both joint research and education projects, and I have to say this event takes this collaboration to an entirely new level. There has been, of course, a very heated debate for those of you who have been following research debates in Norway over the societal relevance of humanities and social sciences. Over the past few years, what is it that we can contribute to society, and is there anything at all worth in humanities and social science research? And I think anyone concerned about that can put such concerns to rest tonight. And in what may seem to the untrained eye to be a somewhat unusual constellation, we bring together here a peace researcher, as well as scientists from the Institute or Department of Archaeology and History and Mathematics. This is in a world where some of us at least worry about the level of fiction in reality. Tonight we will have the opportunity to listen to a discussion about the level of reality in one of the greatest fantasy book and TV series of our time. We have a fabulous head game master, Torkil Risan, from NRK. Torkil works as a radio host for the talk show Salongen at NRK P2, and has also worked with the TV series and not at least hosted a podcast covering TV series like Game of Thrones. So Torkil, please, the floor is yours, and to everyone, please enjoy the night.
Thank you. Thank you, Henrik. I remain seated just to keep this informal. Nice to see you all. I would just like to introduce the panel here today. This is Céline Cunen from the Department of Mathematics. We have here Hans Jacob Orning. He's a professor in history at the University of Oslo. And we have also Siri Åsrustad, who's a senior researcher here at PRIO. They will each hold their own introduction or sort of a statement and some comments regarding their topic and Game of Thrones. And after their three introductions, we will have a general discussion about Game of Thrones. And we hope it will be possible for you all to maybe ask some questions in the latter part of this event. So keep your questions here, and we will hopefully get to have some of them later on. So I think we'll start off with Céline Cunen from the Department of Mathematics.
Okay.
Welcome.
Yeah, thank you for that. I should stay here, I guess. A nice introduction, and thank you for inviting me, PRIO. So yes, I'm from the Department of Mathematics, but I'm not a mathematician, I'm a statistician, which I always point out. For some, the difference is not very large, at least when you're not a mathematician, but for others, it may be significant. And since I view this as a sort of promoter or promoting of statistics, not mathematics in general, but simply statistics, then I feel it's important to point that out. I'm a PhD student. I belong to this research group, Fokustat. You can check out our website if you're interested. And some years ago, I started this project about Game of Thrones. It's not part of my PhD at all, but it was just a hobby. At least in a way, it came out of an exam I had, which I had to search for data sets of some kind. And I guess I was probably watching Game of Thrones, and I had that in my mind. And perhaps I Googled death rates in Game of Thrones. And then I found this thing. So this is the start of the whole story. It was a blog, some epidemiologist, a sort of statistician actually, called Jordan Schermerhorn. And she had collected data from Game of Thrones. She had corrected the age at death, or the current age, for all the persons appearing in the TV series up to a certain point. I think that this is up to season 4. And then she had compared with reality. And what kind of triggered me was that I disagreed with this comparison. I felt it was flawed. And then I wanted to do one that I considered more correct. And the problem here is that, so first of all, I'll explain in some detail what kind of curve we're looking at here, because I don't think everyone here is a statistician, so you might not have thought so much about curves like this before. So this is a survival curve or a / mortality curve. Survival and mortality are, of course, two sides of the same coin. And at the top here, you have 100%, and here is 0. So here is the percentage of the population that are alive at a certain point. And here is the age. So in the beginning, once we are born, we are hopefully all alive. But then at some point, people in the population start to die off at various ages. And then this curve falls downwards. And eventually, when you reach a very high age, let's say 126 or whatever is the max for humans currently, everyone in the population is dead. So then these curves reach 0 here. And so here, the blue curve is the Game of Thrones curve. It seems to fall quite quickly. And then she added Japan, a current modern country, and Afghanistan, a modern country, which is, as we know, at war and so on. And you see, okay, if you look at this, it seems worse to live in the Game of Thrones universe than even in Afghanistan, because you see that this survival curve for Game of Thrones is below the curve for Afghanistan. It falls down much quicker. So, and most people prefer to be alive than dead, so then that means that it's worse to be in Game of Thrones. But what is the problem here? The curve for Afghanistan and Japan, they are population curves. They are based on the entire population in that country, or at least a random sample from that country. But the curve from Game of Thrones is a completely unrandom sample of the imaginary population living in the Game of Thrones universe at a certain point. Of course, that population doesn't exist, but we kind of can imagine that in the whole of Westeros, which we'll see later, there are perhaps millions of imaginary people, and the people we see on the TV screen or in the book, they are not random. They are some sort of important persons, and that makes it impossible to compare these two types of groups. So that was my first motivation, and for the second, that was to kind of attack, or at least argue against this view that Game of Thrones world is horrible. Many people say that, at least whenever there's a season final and someone died, then you will see someone on social media say, oh, this is just the worst show in the world, everyone dies, and it's so violent and horrible. In my view, reality is just as bad, perhaps worse, and everything that has happened on Game of Thrones has probably, except the dragons and the White Walkers, has a likely parallel to real events. So reality is horrible too, and that was my motivation, and I wanted to show that. So now, this is the question I'll answer. First, we have to talk about what should we compare, so kind of what level of violence or horribleness. And here I already said what we'll compare. We'll compare mortality, so the probability of dying at a certain age. And then we'll come to cause of death a bit in the end. Who should compare with? We'll see, and how. Those are statistical methods, and luckily there are many methods in statistics for comparing lifetimes, as we'll do now. So just to start to kind of select a part of reality from which we'll compare Game of Thrones with, I started with The Wars of the Roses, which was actually the reason I even started watching Game of Thrones. Because I heard of Game of Thrones, of course, but in the beginning there was only talk about sex and violence, and it didn't really attract me. It sounded a bit tacky, but then I heard, oh, there are many references to history, and I like history, so and I felt that was fun. And there are so obvious the references. I mean, they are obviously put in by George R.R. Martin in order to please the people that like history. Even you see the map here is of course a kind of England, and And even in the ancient history in the Game of Thrones universe, there is a character called Aegon the Conqueror, the first Targaryen king. He's an obvious reference to William the Conqueror, who crossed the narrow sea from France to England in that case, but from Essos to Westeros in the Game of Thrones case. And of course, in the name of the main noble houses are almost similar to the main noble houses that fought in the Wars of the Roses. And unfortunately, I don't have time to talk so much about Wars of the Roses in themselves. I'll just show a diagram, and you can understand everything from that, I'm sure. But the point is to show that it's complicated. It was a complicated war with lots of characters or persons doing many different things. Most people ending up dead, just as in Game of Thrones, and lots of complicated alliances and marriages and so on. And here I'll have a small kind of hint for something we might discuss later, but I'll just leave it at that for now. So take my word for it, the Wars of the Roses were complicated. Now we have decided we'll look at the Wars of the Roses, but what kind of person should we look at there? Should we look at the general population living in England at that time? No, because we already said we don't want a general sample or a random sample, we want a special sample. And then we have to think in what way the Game of Thrones characters we see on the screen are special. And these are some of their attributes. Most of them are men. We'll see that in a minute. Most of them are noble, so they belong to a noble house, not commoners. If they are not, or at least, even if they are noble, but especially if they are not noble, they are at least important in some way, or just dying in some fancy way, because then that makes for good TV. So those are some characteristics, and where can we look for such a data set in reality? And I thought a bit about this. I didn't immediately come up with the answer, but then, of course, it came to me that Wikipedia is the answer for very many things, and including this thing. So if you haven't looked for it, you wouldn't know, perhaps, that there are thousands of articles in Wikipedia about persons living at a certain point at a certain time. For example, 15th century English people, here there are 1,074, that was 3 years ago, so probably even more now, just articles about persons living in England, and many of them are very small, just this guy was elected to parliament in 14 something, and that's all. And all this information, at least, they are not super famous, all of them, but at least they must have done something important in some way. And that makes them, in a way, comparable to the Game of Thrones persons, because they are also, in some way, important. So then I decided I would extract all this information and use that to compare with the Game of Thrones persons. And I could, of course, have read all these articles myself. I would love to do that, but I had a PhD to write. So then I wrote a computer program extracting this information, especially their birth date and their death date, automatically. This is the plan for rest. I would love to talk to you about how I did that, but I don't have time for much details. But I will have some details about the results, about the comparison between Game of Thrones and the Wars of the Roses people. I'll give some hint about causes of death, how we should think about that, and some conclusions in the end. So, first of all, just a quick word about how I wrote this computer program for extracting Wikipedia dates. This is a Wikipedia we all know and love. This is how we look at it. This is a certain article about the person in this data set. And here there are dates, 1475 to 1511, and so on. And this is good for humans, but there is a version of Wikipedia called the Wikipedia API, which is made for computers, and that looks like this. So it's just text and symbols, but it's very easy to extract information from that. So once you know that this version of the website exists and it's completely free and everyone can enter it, then you can write computer programs that look up these pages and find the relevant information in them. So if you're interested in history and computer science and so on, feel free. There are millions of interesting datasets to find here, I'm sure. But now I'll just show you the end result. So after some hand cleaning, I had a lot of persons, and these are just a simple sample of those, over 400 persons, and I removed all those with incomplete dates and those who didn't live under the Wars of the Roses. And I added the kind of nobility variable by hand, because that was the simplest thing to do, because since you can tell from the name or the occupation if a person is noble or not. At least I have kind of an extended definition of nobility, also extending to cardinals, even though they're not strictly speaking nobles, but he is a prince of the church, so we can consider him living a lifestyle comparable to nobles at that time. But here you can see some fun stuff we can find here. Strange people I would never heard about before. Blind Harry, a Scottish minstrel. And this guy here, Alton Parr, living to the fine age of 152 years. I had to remove him because from the date set I didn't believe in his claim to that age. But so just to show how many fun things there are to find there. And this is how I coded in data. This is a kind of statistician way to look at it. This is a variable called dead. If it's 0, you're alive. If it's 1, you're dead. Gender, if it's 0, you're a man. If it's 1, you're a woman. Nobility, 1 means a noble in my definition, and a 0 means a commoner. So this is just to show how we do stuff. And similarly for Game of Thrones, this was the data set from this blog. Here, only spoilers for season 1, so no danger here, I'm sure. And these, I'm sure you all know these persons. Here, there's a difference, as you see immediately. Some are still alive. And there are various genders, of course, and nobility status and so on, too. And then we can start to compare. The quickest thing is just to look at the numbers. Now I have 458 persons from Wars of the Roses, 324 from Game of Thrones. Here, everyone is dead. Here, a bit more than, less than half are dead. Here we have a minority of women, and here too, but we have even less women here, in reality. We have a majority of nobles, and a majority of nobles here too. So, just by looking at this, we see that, yes, in a way, they are biased in a bit the same way. So, kind of my hope about searching the Wikipedia, or scraping the Wikipedia for data, seems to be okay. And obvious start for comparing their ages would be to look at their mean age, for example, in the data set. And we can do that here. That's a naive analysis, I've warned you here. Here's the mean age is 57 years. Quite okay. But remember that this is not a random sample, again, of people from the Middle Ages. Here it's 34 years. So just looking at these numbers, it seems, oh, this number is much smaller than this one. It seems worse to live in the Game of Thrones universe. But of course, that is not a correct comparison, again, because here many people are still alive. And that brings us to a statistical concept, which I'll go through very quickly, which is that of censoring. So when a person is still alive, you might reach the age you currently have, for example, 29 years in my case, or and I might die tomorrow, and then that will be my age. Or I may live on and reach another age, and that, in many cases, will be much higher than my current one, hopefully. So, for example, 102 years, which is, guess who this is, the maximum age I have in the dataset, is Master Aemon from the Black Tower. Cast Black, sorry. So, but we shouldn't throw just out all the living persons, because there is information in the ones that are still alive. And there are statistical tools built to take into account that information, and we will use something called Kaplan-Meier curves in order to take that into account. So you must just take my word for it again, but it actually works. And the curves, they look like the survival curves we saw before. The one from Game of Thrones is a bit special because it takes into account the living ones, as I mentioned, by showing them with these crosses here, and also by having mathematics going on in the background. But this is the same curve we saw before. Here it's 1 or 0 to 1 instead of 0 to 100, but that's the same thing. So in the start, at age 0, everyone is alive, and then people fall down eventually. And this is a way to compare ages, as we talked about before, the probability of reaching a certain age. And just looking at this, here's the Game of Thrones is in red, the Wars of the Roses are in black. It seems still worse to live in the Game of Thrones universe. The red curve is just below the black one and falls down quicker. But let's break it down into the various groups, for example, by gender. That's the first obvious choice. Here, the black and gray are from the Wars of the Roses. The red and, I don't know which color it is, light red, are from the Game of Thrones. And the women are the dark curves. Here, nothing particularly interesting goes on, possibly. The genders are not so different, certainly not in the Game of Thrones world, but a bit different in the Wars of the Roses universe. You see here some signs that women seem to die off more in the ages between 20 and 40, and that should bring the thoughts to how the world was before modern medicine, that the risk of bearing a child is very large, and that could be a sign of that. But otherwise, there's not so much going on here. But if we break down by nobility status, we see this one, and this is kind of the whole point of my talk, the main message, that actually here, the black curve from the Wars of the Roses nobles and the red curve of the Game of Thrones nobles are more or less the same. They are kind of on each other here and not very different here. And we can even do statistical tests to see the difference, and we find then that they are not different. So this is the kind of selling point, or I'm not sure what, that in fact, when looking at the nobles in two universes, they are not particularly different. But when looking at the commoners, the pattern is completely opposite. While it's much better to be a commoner than a noble when you lived in the Wars of the Roses, at least for the persons in these samples, today the commoners are far over the nobles curve. The opposite is true in the Game of Thrones universe. There, the commoners have it much worse in terms of dying off than the nobles. So that is interesting. That points you at either real differences in the universes or differences in the sampling mechanisms, which I'll come back to. But now for a bit about causes of death, and I probably should round off soon. So this work of mine has gotten some interest in various places, and even gotten some angry and constructive comments on the internet. So this is a comment about my article here, or blog post. And what he says, you don't need to, I'm not going to read it off. He says, okay, perhaps their immortality is quite similar, but the main difference is that in Game of Thrones, most of people die by violence, but in the Wars of the Roses, most people died by sicknesses, diseases and epidemics and so on. And that is probably very true. And there's not so much I mean, it's obviously true for most groups of people in the state set that, just by looking at the Game of Thrones people, not everyone is dead yet, of course, but 83% of those who have died by violence. And that is a very, very high number, much higher than in any kind of realistic data set from... unless you, of course, take a sample of knights or something. But here in the Wars of the Roses state set, we have all sorts of professions, like lots of parliament members and minstrels walking around the countrysides, or I'm not sure what they do, but and they generally don't die by violence. At least it doesn't say so in Wikipedia. But we can find information in some cases about cause of death in Wikipedia, especially if they had a violent death. And then I have done some analysis on causes of death, and even though Game of Thrones still appears to be much more violent, if we just look at the group of noble men, which is the biggest group in both universes, there is actually less difference, and even we can model it and see that there are patterns that are quite similar. And for those who have studied Wars of the Roses, you will know that for the nobility, the death rate was very, very high. I mean, both houses, Lancaster and York, actually kind of their male lines more or less died out, as far as I know. So. and all the pretenders eventually died. And if you go through the list of many of the nobles there are very many of them who have been decapitated, executed, and so on. So it was a violent time also for the Wars of Roses people. And now I probably said most of these things, and these are my conclusions and my final slide. So I hope to do more, produce more analysis of these cause of death things eventually, and make new blog posts. And so stay tuned if you're interested in that. And I think that I'll leave the rest for the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Céline. And once again, if you have specific questions to Céline's introduction here, make a mental note of it, and we take the questions for later. But now let's give the floor to Hans Jacob Orning, a professor in history.
Yeah, it's not every day that I have a big audience like this, and my students, they told me a year ago that Hans Jacob, if you are going to teach medieval history, you have to watch Game of Thrones because all your students have seen it. That will be the point of reference, so if you haven't seen it, you are really a stranger, even in the Middle Ages. So I went on with quite much skepticism to look at Game of Thrones, and now in the last year I've seen it twice. And the second time with a notebook where I write down things, because it's quite interesting. As an historian, you always want to look at historical series like Vikings, for instance, which I guess some of you have seen. It's all these historical characters, Harald Harefair, it's Rollo, but it's a very shallow analysis. So my hypothesis is that you learn a lot more about medieval politics from watching Game of Thrones than watching Vikings or even Last Kingdom, which is better, but nevertheless also quite shallow. And this is what I'm going to explore. So my title has been slightly changed. It's about medieval politics. I'm not going to compare anything specific with the Game of Thrones, but I'm going to analyze it as a mirror to the Middle Ages and maybe also today. Yes. So it's a lot of different. One interesting thing is that the last generation before that was Lord of the Rings, and comparing Game of Thrones with Lord of the Rings is very interesting. I mean, it's at least two very big differences. It's not black and white, and the frontiers are shifting all the time, which is something that I shall come back to in the conclusion. It's a very, very different universe from the Lord of the Rings. So let's go to the Game of Thrones, and I shall not talk so much about how the universe looks like the medieval one, which it does, but I'm going to talk about three aspects of this Game of Thrones universe, which could be compared to this drawing, which is of Old Norse mythology. It's made later on, but it's a very good illumination. Here you see the gods living in Åsgård, then the humans are living in Midgård, and then you have this serpent surrounding the human universe, and the giants are living outside, which is very parallel, of course, to the Game of Thrones universe with the wall. So I'm going to talk first about Åsgård, about the center, then I'm going to talk about Midgård, about the realm of the seven kingdoms, and finally I'm going to look at the whole universe with what is outside the wall. The king is, of course, a very prominent person in the Game of Thrones. And concerning power, it's very interesting to see how Game of Thrones discuss the issue of royal power. Before Joffrey becomes king, Cersei says to him that when you will become king, you will decide what is the truth. So the king has all power to decide what is true and what is false, something which we know from today's leaders that they also try to determine what is. But is the power of the king so total? When Tommen is to succeed as a king in the fourth series, then he talks with his grandfather, Tywin, and Tywin asks Tommen, what is the ideal king? And Tommen, which is a nice guy, he first says that, well, ideal king is holy. Well, Tywin says, you can be holy, but there was a holy king, and he died of hunger, because he didn't care to eat. Okay, then what about a just king, a fair king, which is a very important quality? Well, Tywin says, there was a fair king, but he had an unfair brother, and that was the end of the fair king. What about a strong king then? Well, Robert Baratheon was strong, and he thought that winning a battle was the same as governing, as ruling. So finally, Tommen comes up with the right decision, which is wisdom, to be a wise king. And to be a wise king is to know what you know, and to know what you don't know, and to talk about what you don't know with them who knows. And who knows? The counselors knows. Tywin knows. So Tywin is putting the net around Tommen from the beginning. And this is something I shall return to in a short second. But first, this is a discussion which is very, very medieval. This image is from the national law of Norway from 1274, which has a parallel arrangement going on now in the National Library. I'm sure it's not that many people there. This is the king. This is the fair king. The king who has to find the right balance when he's going to make his judgments. And we have a very important piece of source from the High Middle Ages, the King's Mirror, which talks at length about how the king has to make a settlement between four sisters. The sister of truth, the sister of justice, the sister of mercy, and the sister of peace. And if the king cannot find the right solution between those those sisters, he will not be a just king. We also have this discussion very much in Game of Thrones on whether a king should be hard or whether he should be soft. So, for instance, Cersei, she's a prominent proponent of the hard king. She talks about weeds that we have to exterminate. We also have the Baratheons. Ours is the fury, are their slogan. And they talk about how a king needs to be fed. But on the other hand, we have Daenerys, who wants to be loved. We have Marjorie, who goes on to show charity to people and says that if you love people, you will get tenfold back. So this discussion about the good, about the mild and the hard king is something which is very parallel to the medieval universe. And in episode number 3, I don't remember who says it, he says that a good king knows when you save an opponent and when you crush him. This is the king's power. He has to balance these qualities. So what about the bottom of society, the peasants? The peasants are caught in a similar kind of dilemma. On the one hand, we have the peasants are without any power, and as Céline has showed, they die at a very high rate. They have no honor. So Cersei, for instance, when they are left off in the wedding, she wants to feed the dogs and not the poor people. Whereas on the other hand, we have Marjorie again. But we also have a very interesting episode in Joffrey's reign when he is going somewhere and suddenly a rebellion comes up. And what is interesting about this rebellion is it comes completely unpredictable on Joffrey. He says, I thought that you loved me, but the people don't love him. And this is a quality which we find many times in the Middle Ages. For instance, in this incident, 1358, what we call the Jacquerie, peasant uprising in the 100-Year War, where the peasants suddenly erupt and they really kill people, nobles, in the most horrible way. And the nobles have no idea of why they are doing this. They simply have no contact with them. So once Tywin talks with Arya, she says that she is the daughter of a mason. And then Tywin says, well, can a mason read? And then Arya says, how many masons have you talked to? in between the king and the peasants is politics. And politics in Game of Thrones is foremost about council. The small council, they have the big council, and this we of course know very much from the Middle Ages. Here is the parliament, but we also have an informal council of the medieval kings, which is much more important than these formal occasions. So I think that some of the most fascinating figures in Game of Thrones are these councillors, such as Tyrion, such as Jorah Mormont, and such as what's his name? You remember? That was very good. And it's very interesting how the power of the councillors are built up, because it's solely built on networks, personal networks. So the first thing that Baelish, for instance, tells Sansa is that everybody is a liar, and everybody is a better liar than you are. It's a universe with bribes, so that, for instance, Bronn, he's a friend of Tyrion, but he's also a rented soldier who has to be paid. And he always talks about this. You have to pay me better. I got a more expensive lifestyle now. You have to pay me better in order to keep me as a friend. So bribes is internal to this system. It's a pragmatic universe. Baelish is once asked, "Are you loyal?" And Baelish says, "I'm pragmatic. What's the point of being loyal to a dead man?" It's a society where oaths are broken all the time. Jaime is once asked, "You broke your oath now." And he says, "Well, I've sworn so many oaths, so I have to break some." So it's really a universe which is governed by cynicism and manipulating. But it's quite interesting that these councillors are very, very vulnerable. I think that my favorite passage from Game of Thrones is when it's Baelish who talks to Cersei, and Baelish, or is it Varys? I don't remember. Saying, "You know, Cersei, that knowledge is power." Foucault. "You have to be friendly with me because I know everything. I have got people everywhere who tells me what is happening." And then Cersei asks her bodyguards, "Seize this man, arrest him, kill him." Power is power. It's such a wonderful. I mean, it really makes jokes with everything that has been since postmodernism. And this is a quote, and there are endless quotes. This is a courtier in the 12th century in England saying, "The court is a pleasing place only for those who obtain its favor, and this favor comes regardless of reason, establishes itself regardless of merit, arrives obscurely from unknown causes." So this is the court. Is it only a court where everything is fluctuating, where everything is allowed? No, it's not. Well, sorry. The army is a prolongation of the court, because the army looks very solid. But when you take down the army to its ingredients, you see with Robb Stark, for instance, you cannot dissolve your army because everybody wants to go home. The soldiers are complaining all the time. I have my own interests. When Tyrion is going to make his army fight, he says, "Don't fight for your king, fight for your homes." And this is very, very medieval, something which we find all the time in the Middle Ages. You have to have a private motive for fighting. So armies might look big, but they are very, very vulnerable. King Sverre, for instance, of Norway, half of his saga is about how he tries to convince his men that you should fight for me. And this is a feudal army, or the Leidang in Norwegian history. So the only exception from this is Daenerys, who tries to make a perfect army of Unsullied. But once you free people who are unfree and loyal, there is the question of if you are free, are you really loyal then? I mean, Daenerys is really the big experiment of trying to create an ideal society, and she also immediately encounters all the problems that this carries with it. The family is at least a solid element in this, and as Tywin says to Tyrion, the house that puts family first will always defeat the house that puts the whims and wishes of its sons and daughters first. This is what every patriarch has told throughout history, and it's what has been broken always. Also in Norwegian history, for one thing, family is different from everyone. Everyone has got a different family. For instance, Cersei, she has got other bonds of loyalty than Tywin has. So a family is not a closed, bounded unit. Secondly, family is extremely political. So as is told many times in this series, wars have been started by marriage breaches, with Robb, of course, as a prime example here. So there is no really secure point here, even if it's an attempt to create family, honor as a solid basis. Do I have 5 more minutes, or? Maybe.
Yeah, you have.
I didn't keep track of time, so I'm a bit uncertain. Let's move on to the next circle. We have been inside the center, inside Åsgård. Now we are moving to Midgard, to the 7 kingdoms, to the realm. And Game of Thrones is a realm, one realm, because the King's Landing is at top, and it's a king at the top. However, it's not a unified territory. It's at least 3 principles that make this very complicated. One is that the king has got alliances. He hasn't got obedience or subordinates or subjects. He has got allies, and he needs to negotiate with them. Secondly, there is a center-periphery dimension, so that the further away, the less control. The tyranny of distance, as we often speak of in pre-modern history. And we can see that when Theon Greyjoy killed the ravens, there is no contact between the center and periphery. And finally, it's a lot of rivalry that can be encompassed within this structure. So even if you live in the same realm, even if you are bound together, you'd never know really whether your ally will be a friend or an enemy. So for instance, the Starks, they serve as the king's hand. They serve as guardians of the wardens of the north, and they also serve as outright enemies. Other persons who are caught in the middle in these power games are people such as Walder Frey, whose allegiance nobody knows about. A very important person in medieval politics, this kind of broker, this kind of mediator, and since there are so many players, it's a lot of room for these people whom you don't know really who will they serve. And a third person who is very interesting from a medieval perspective, Theon Greyjoy, who is a hostage, who grow bonds with his hostage family, but also have his own biological father, and he is caught in an impossible dilemma. And as he says himself, I choose wrong. My real father died at King's Landing, but he realizes it too late. This structure of the 7 kingdoms could be compared to a lot of historical parallels. For instance, England before 870, when you had a lot of different kingdoms. It could be compared to medieval Europe, with a lot of states, realms competing. We talk about the state system from 1648, but it starts much before that. Or we could talk about inside the Holy Roman Empire. The emperor is only a figurehead. It's a lot of very important magnates who have a lot of power. Or in Norway, this is a map of the most important farms. And you can see they are either in, I cannot speak as I do this, either in Trøndelag, either in the western part of Norway or in the eastern part of Norway. And during the Norwegian civil wars, there is never one fraction the Birkebeiner and the Bagler, you know them by name, nobody of these are able to control 3 places in one row. They only can control 2 places or maybe only 1. It's very much the same dynamic as in Game of Thrones. So the question in this society is, who is the enemy? Is the enemy your friend? Is it your real enemy? And when does a friend become an enemy? And secondly, what is war and what is peace? When do we have war in this society? When do we not have war? It's something which is at stake all the time. And one could say that it's a permanent war in Game of Thrones, or that it's hardly ever a war. The last, the other, the Utgard, the realm of the giants. And here we, of course, have a much more permanent border, namely the wall, which is something that separates chaos from order. But this starts to crack very soon. Well, first, it's the same as we have in Old Norse mythology between the giants and the gods. But in Old Norse mythology, it's a lot of contact between the giants and the gods, and they are, for one reason or another, the gods really want to marry giant women. Even if they are ugly, they want to marry them. We don't know why, but the same happens in Game of Thrones, because when the White Walkers come up, then the wildlings are caught in the middle. So the wildlings are seeking alliances with the center. And this is what happens in the last episodes, which I think is... I don't like it very much, because what happens now is that what was a Game of Thrones between a lot of contenders is now brought down to a bipolar conflict between good and evil, the conflicts that we know from the Lord of the Rings, and which we very easily tend to think about conflicts in matter of. So I think that, no, I shall not take the modern things. I shall end here and say that I think that Game of Thrones, I hope that it will keep on to this very blurred fighting between very, very difficult with actors who don't know, are you enemy or a friend? And I hope that it doesn't become this black and white, very boring game. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to Hans Jacob, and we will continue his remarks there regarding the last seasons, of course, in the general discussions afterwards. But I think we'll conclude the introductions with Siri Aas Rustad from here, from Prio. Yeah, the floor is yours.
So I'll continue with the modern stuff then, since that's what I work with. So I'm a political scientist working here at Prio, so I'm at home. I was given the title, has it gotten better or worse? Now this is of course a bit difficult, because what is becoming what? Game of Thrones is not ended yet, so we don't really know if it's getting better or worse. But listening to my two colleagues here, it's easy to compare it to the medieval ages, so we can see if it compares well with the modern times as well. So similarly to Céline, I also need to find something I can compare, because obviously looking at the ways the conflicts are fought and the means of conflict, it's not that similar. There are no dragons in modern warfare, as far as we have seen. So we need to find out what can we compare, and what I compare is the logic of violence. Why do we see the type of conflicts that we see when we see them, and why do they happen? So, in Game of Thrones, there's lots of different conflicts. I've chosen one. I've chosen one that's called the War of the Five Kings. Now, that's a clear civil war. That's what we would call a civil war. I think that's quite easy. The philosopher and political theorist Edmund Burke said civil wars strike deepest of all into the manners of people. They dictate their politics, they corrupt their morals, they even pervert the natural taste of equity and justice. And I think that's quite clear in the Game of Thrones. That's what's happening. So Littlefinger, he's deceiving everyone, trying to cheat his way to power, doesn't end so well. We know Ramsay Bolton's cruelty, King Joffrey's cruelty, and even the Catherine Stark's trial to revenge her husband's death by kidnapping Tyrion. It's not fair. He's just the son of, or the uncle of the king who did it. But it's sort of this, I need justice, I'm gonna kill you. But this happens in real life as well, and in modern warfare. We have the use of child soldiers. We have rape as means of conflict. We have schoolgirls being kidnapped. We have genocides like Rwanda. It's pretty nasty as well. So to start off, to look at civil war in a modern perspective, we have this graph, which is what we do at PRIO is to look at conflicts. There are a couple of things here which are interesting in the perspective of conflict. So, first of all, there are very few international wars. So wars fought between countries. All the light blue here represent international wars. What we do have is a lot of civil wars. And that's the orange and the green. And I'm sorry for those of you who are colorblind. It actually is green up here. And that's make up the largest part of the conflicts we see today. Now, the green part I've shown up here, and as you can see, we saw a decrease of conflict after the end of the Soviet Union and the Cold War, and now it's increasing. But what this green part is indicating is IS infiltrating a lot of conflicts, such as in Nigeria, the Philippines, Bangladesh. I'll get back to that a little bit later as well. Okay, but now what is a conflict? How do we count these things? Because that's what we do. We count stuff, we count conflicts. And as a quantitative researcher, we need to have rigid definitions of what conflicts are. So what we consider a conflict or a civil war, first of all, it has to be fought between two actors. And if it's a civil war, it has to be the state. Second, there has to be more than 25 dead, which is not a problem in the Game of Thrones. And it also has to be you need to fight over either controlling the government, or it has to be over a territory. So this suggests that one country can have several civil wars going on at the same time. So when we talk about the war in Syria, for example, we say the war in Syria. But in fact, it's up to 3 civil wars going on at the same time. So in my graph here, Syria accounts for 3 of these. So I tried to force this definition onto the war or conflict in Game of Thrones. And when I was looking into people being killed, so how many people are being killed, I guess I needed some more coding rules than people coding modern conflicts, such as you can only die once. So there's no White Walkers in here. Okay, so in the Game of Thrones, what is the state? So the state is the government who controls a territory. And in Game of Thrones, it's the 7 kingdoms, which is the main part of Westeros, but it's not the entire part. So the 7 kingdoms only goes up to the wall, which means that the conflict between the wildlings, or the free people, and Westeros, the 7 kingdoms, so the fight at Castle Black, that's an international war. It's not a civil war. And in one episode, they say that in 1,000 years, there's only been 6 attempts from the wildlings to attack the 7 kingdoms. So I guess international wars are as rare in Game of Thrones as they seem to be in reality right now. Second, the state in Game of Thrones is whoever sits on the Iron Throne. So at the beginning of the series is the Baratheon who sit there. But we know that when we start War of the 5 Kings, it's King Joffrey, Baratheon. But we all know that he's really not a Baratheon, he's a Lannister. So in the way I've interpreted or coded my conflicts, is any attack on the Iron Throne or on the Lannisters should be seen as a civil war. Okay, So there has to be these rebels or contenders towards the throne, and there are certainly a few of those in Game of Thrones as well. So first of all, we have Stannis Baratheon, who claims to be the real heir to the throne by being the eldest brother of Robert. Then we have Renly Baratheon, who claims to be a better king. He's a younger brother, but he thinks he's going to be a better king than his older brother Stannis. And then finally, of course, we have Robb Stark. So that means that any fight that between the state and these three would be a civil war. Now we know that Renly was killed by his own brother before he was even able to attack the state. Both Robb and Stannis were able to inflict severe damage on the Lannisters and the state. But we also distinguish between what are the motives for the various rebels. We look at if it's a governmental conflict or a territorial. The governmental means that you want to control the state. And that's certainly true for the two first, the Baratheon brothers. They want to sit on the Iron Throne themselves. Well, Robb Stark, he doesn't really want to take the throne. He wants to revenge his father, but then he's sort of nominated as the King of the North by his bannerman. So that's more of a territorial conflict. He wants to succeed with the North. He wants to be its own sovereign state. And this is quite common in today's conflicts as well. So this is the Philippines, and all of the dots, the red and the blue dots, represent conflict events. So that's where a battle happened, basically. All the red dots are a conflict between the Philippine government and the CPP, which is a communist group who wants to seize the power from the bourgeois, or what do they call it? It's the reactionary bourgeois regime. So it's a clear governmental conflict. And the blue dots are the conflict on the island of Mindanao, which is an Islamic conflict where they want to succeed. They want to control or get more autonomy of that area. So if we look at the development or global development of how territorial and governmental conflicts develop, it's about, well, at least when we get into the 70s, about half territorial and half governmental. But you see at the end here, it peaks with territorial. And this corresponds with the peak that I mentioned about the IS infiltrating a lot of ongoing conflicts. And that's because when IS goes into a conflict, they do not attempt to seize power over the country. They want to gain it or implement the territory in the Islamic State and into the Caliphate. That's why they are coded as territorial conflicts. Okay, so of course, as the attentive Game of Thrones fans you are, you've noticed that I've only talked about 4 out of 5 kings. And the last one is, of course, King Balon Greyjoy of the Iron Islands. Now, he doesn't really fight the Iron Throne, right? Max Weber says that a state is an entity that successfully claims monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory, which means that a state should be able to control all the violence going on. They should be sort of having the monopoly of violence. However, what's happening when you're in a civil war and you're fighting others, they lose this monopoly, and there becomes a vacuum about who's controlling which areas. And King Balon is smart, and he uses this. As you can see from his quote here, he's using the fact that Robb Stark is going south to revenge his father to actually seize power in the north. And this is a good example of this is when Theon comes home. He's going to try to convince his father to support Robb Stark, but he ends up with claiming loyalty to his father, hoping to sort of become the long-lost son coming home. Instead, he's giving one ship, the Sea Beach, and his sister Yara is given the rest of the fleet. And his father tells him to go raid some fisher villages. Now, Theon doesn't do that, as we know. He goes straight to Winterfell to seize Winterfell from the younger brothers of Stark, of Robb, who's there now. And he does this to impress his father. So this is what we call a non-state conflict. And a non-state conflict is a conflict, surprisingly enough, doesn't include a state. And by going into Winterfell, Theon Greyjoy starts a sort of a series of a lot of non-state conflicts going on in the north. You have, the Greyjoy taking over Winterfell. Then Ramsay Bolton comes and takes over Winterfell. That's when he kidnaps Theon. And then you have the Battle of the Bastards when Jon Snow comes and reclaims Winterfell. And all of these are without Lannisters. So this mix of state-based and non-state-based conflicts are quite common in modern warfare as well. So this is a graph over Syria. The blue area represents civil conflicts. So any conflicts where the state is fighting a rebel group. But the yellow represents the number of non-state conflicts where you have two actors it's not the state fighting. So we see at the beginning of the war, it seems that the state-based conflicts are quite dominating. But then as we go along, the state probably loses more control. This type of conflict increases a lot. However, on the other hand, we see that the state-based conflicts are the conflicts that takes more life. So it's a much higher death toll in state-based conflict than non-state. But we also see at the end of the conflict, we now know that troops are able to hit IS and hopefully Syria will be, if not peaceful, less violent. We see that number of deaths in non-state conflicts increases. So while they're able to take down IS, gives room for other groups to work. I did a similar thing with the War of the Five Kings. And there's some same similarities. In the beginning, there's mostly civil wars, so state-based conflicts. But then we have a much higher number of non-state conflicts. And we also see the same development when it comes to battle deaths here. That at the end of the conflict, there's very few state-based battle deaths, but there's an increase in the non-state. So Stathis Kalivis is one of the more important political theorists within conflict. He has a book called The Logic of Violence in Civil War. And he states, civil war provides a mere pretext, a costume in which to clothe the pursuit of a private conflict. And I think the Red Wedding is a perfect example of this. So Robb Stark is killed. I'm sorry for those who haven't seen season 2 yet. Because he doesn't want to marry Walder Frey's daughter. It's a private conflict. I mean, it's his revenge for humiliating him. But Kalivis further say, civil war is also a process that connects the collective actors' quest for local advantages. Violence can also be a selective benefit that produces local mobilities via alliances. What is not so clear in the series is that the Red Wedding is really orchestrated by Tywin Lannister, making an alliance with Roose Bolton, who's supposed to support Stark. You remember in the Red Wedding when Kathleen Stark looks at Roose Bolton and he has his armors on and she realizes that something is wrong. So it becomes a part of the civil war, even if it is this private conflict, right? And after the Red Wedding, Roose Bolton is named the Warden of the North, betraying the Starks. And again, looking at the global trends when it comes to state-based versus non-state-based conflicts, we see that there has been in the last few years an increase in state-based conflict compared to increase in non-state conflict compared to state-based conflicts. So, for example, in the Central African Republic, a country that not a lot of people know that much about, they had a civil war in 2013. And now they only have, well, only. In 2017, they had 8 non-state conflicts. So we see the same trend that you have a civil or war, a state-based conflict, and then something happens, you lose control, and there's room for other non-state conflicts. And what is happening in the Central African Republic is that the government can really control the capital. So there's a lot of stuff going around in the outskirts. And this is kind of similar to what Cersei is planning to do when the Great War hits. She wants to sit in King's Landing, which she can protect. Hopefully the others will fight the White Walkers, and then she can at least keep power there. Okay, so I've talked about battles and knights and soldiers being killed, but of course there's a lot of civilians also being killed in Game of Thrones. And this is what when we work with conflict statistics, call one-sided violence. So these are civilians being killed by either the state or by non-state actors. And this is from the riot that Jacob also mentioned, where King Joffrey is surprised by the angry mob who's hungry because there's no food, they're starving, and they start shouting, "You're a bastard," and throwing cow pies at him. And what he says is just kill them all. And there's about a dozen of civilians killed by the King's Guard during that. So that's a typical one-sided violence event conducted by the state. But then there are other episodes that are not so clearly either linked to the conflict, but is sort of happening during conflict because of the conflict. And one episode of this is Sandor Clegane is sort of joining this peaceful village who's building a church after he was supposed to be dead. And then there are 3 people from the Brotherhood Without Banners who come, and they want to rob them, and they just kill off all of them, right? And this is crime, but it's also part of the conflict. So the Brotherhood Without Banner it's a group, it's an actor, but you can't really say it's part of the conflict. And this is a difficult type of violence to include in conflict studies. Today we see the same thing happening in Mexico, for example. Mexico doesn't really have a conflict. There are a few non-state conflicts, but there is about 20,000 people killed in homicide each year. And most of these are killed in fights between drug cartels. So this type of violence kind of falls outside of the violence and conflict definitions that we have. Okay, so get back to this question. Has it gotten better or worse? It's kind of hard to compare, but I've tried. So I've put together all of the people dying in the 4 types of violence that I've talked about: international wars, civil wars, non-state wars, and one-sided violence. And since the War of the 5 Kings lasts for 6 years, I've then looked at conflicts in modern time from 2012 to 2017. So we have a time frame that's comparable. Now, Syria compromises about more than 40% of all the killings in the last 6 years. But 7 kingdoms get in 3rd place, and it's quite comparable with Afghanistan and Iraq. So it seems it's not that unrealistic after all. Yeah.
Thank you. So thanks to Siri Ås-Rustad from Prio there. So now we'll open the general discussion where we leave the academics for a while. No, I'm sure you will bring them in rapidly, but I think I want to start with something you said, Hans Jacob. You said that you were losing interest in. You think it was much poorer now, the later seasons in Game of Thrones than the first ones. Let me just and you were talking about the good versus the evil, and it's bipolar. It's a dual conflict more than what you have been talking about with the many conflicts. But isn't it an easy argument to make that the White Walkers and the threat across the wall is comparable to the climate change and the unknown threat that it represents to our world now, and that it's in my opinion it's very interesting to see how the different actors and characters and states react to these threats in Game of Thrones. Take Cersei for one example, who she's the Donald Trump of Game of Thrones. Everybody else can fix that, and let me just make some short-term savings. So how you guys feel about that with that comparison? Hans Jacob, you can start. You were critical.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah. Good. Yes, that climate dimension I've not thought about, but that's of course a very interesting dimension to it. When I say I'm disappointed by the tendency to make this into a battle between two parties, it is because we are so used to that. I mean, we always think about conflicts in terms of two parties fighting one another, and often also making one party good and one party bad. And if we look, and this is of course also the model for the classical war, with two parties fight against, well, the two states against one another. Whereas what Siri talked about, these new wars, it's much more complicated. It's much. I mean, in Afghanistan, what parties are participating? Who are against whom? Who are legitimate? Who are not? And this is very typical for the Middle Ages. That it's many parties, and they have. I mean, nobody will acknowledge the other one. So it's much more blurred. And I think this is much more typical of human societies than this situation when we have one party against one another. This is typical, for instance, are there any Danes here from Denmark? Denmark is a
she doesn't want to be known. She's just an unknown Danish person.
Yeah, Denmark shouldn't have existed. Because they are just a small vorte, as I call it in Norwegian, on top of Germany. But what happens every time Germany gets strong? Denmark gets strong, because they have to defend themselves. And when Denmark gets strong, Norway is threatened, so Norway has to be strong. And this is a situation of mobilization when you have a big external enemy. Then we have this two-party struggle. But once Germany is gone, once Denmark is gone, everything goes on as usual, and it's much more blurred, many more parties. So I think this is much more interesting to go into. And Game of Thrones has managed in 7 seasons to keep this very complicated pattern in the focus, and I'm very impressed by that.
Thank you. Yeah, Céline.
I have a comment, because I think it was me who said this climate change thing too, but about the White Walkers. So I consider them, they are one party, but they are also a kind of natural disaster, because they are alive, but they have no kind of special agency. They're just evil, and we don't really know what they want. They just want to kill people, but it's very kind of simple and just like a natural disaster. And I also agree with Hans that I don't like so much the recent seasons, and that's because kind of disaster movies are not as fun as war movies. Everyone knows that disaster movies are like there's a natural disaster and you have to fight it, or you have to try to survive. But it's very easy. The dynamics are easy. It's mostly for the effects and so on, just like the recent seasons of Game of Thrones have become.
So you want to make a comment, Siri?
Sure, I can, not on the climate change, but which I agree with. I think it's a good analogy. But it's so if we picture this big fight between the White Walkers and the 7 Kingdoms, and I'm getting back to the academics. I'm sorry.
2 minutes.
Yeah. So it's the common outcome of conflicts is actually just sort of more conflicts and lower level conflicts. So we might just get back to what Hans Jacob wants here. It's just having more type of smaller conflicts around. If anybody survives.
But based on your and with your scholars and obviously have studied things that are applicable to the Game of Thrones universe, and maybe you could just spoil season 8 for us based on your academical backgrounds. What is the most logical conclusion to the series?
So since I have the mic, I'll start. So I think we need to look at the comparing what are the resources they have, and obviously the White Walkers became much stronger when they got a zombie dragon. I mean,
yeah,
seriously.
He looks wounded though.
Yes, and they only got one. So.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, the Targaryens and Jon Snow and all, they have 2 dragons. They mined a lot of dragon glass. They also realized that Valyrian steel can kill White Walkers. So they have advanced on their war technology. So I'm not so sure whether the White Walkers are better right now. I think maybe the Seven Kingdoms have a chance.
But now you have that is it's between the White Walkers and mankind. Yeah. But who will eventually sit on the Iron Throne? You know this.
Cersei is sitting there. So
That you.
Of course. I mean, she is the evil queen.
Do you agree? Will Cersei sit on the Iron Throne?
She's so wonderful. I mean,
first Brexit
I love
and
her
then
so
Trump and then
much more
Cersei.
than Daenerys. She's so boring. I mean, Cersei, then you get really a lot of. I mean, to spend the evenings with Cersei would be wonderful. All these quarrels.
I'm not sure what
She's
kind
like
of
my
evening.
wife. She's no, I didn't say that. But she's sitting on the fence. So that's very interesting. That she's not willing to participate in this. So that's going to be very interesting. What happens? Maybe the 2 other parties, they weaken one another so much that she can really gain the upper hand. What do you think, Céline?
I don't think I have kind of an academic answer to this, or because of course I could, as a statistician, you are supposed to be able to predict the future and so on, but you're also very careful with what you do, so I can't just throw out something out. But I can say what I would want to happen, and that is for everyone to die, all the humans and the White Walkers to win.
Okay. What is that based on?
And that is because I feel that is that would be in line with the message of the show. It's a sad message, but it would be the realism of that I liked in the starting seasons, that people can't cooperate even if they are forced to, and they are petty and they have their own agendas and they are egoistic, and it's not a fantasy story. It is a fantasy story, but I felt it was an anti-fantasy story where there were, this is well known, but there were no obvious heroes, and I mean things didn't go right for the heroes at least, and there were little control, and those were the things I liked. That is kind of realistic. So either, but it's a bit bleak, but perhaps just the breakdown of the Seven Kingdoms and splitting up into, or the breakdown of the unified Seven Kingdoms and splitting up in several kingdoms.
So the idealist in you would like to send a message to mankind: we need to cooperate, or otherwise just look at Game of Thrones, we will all die.
I don't really. I don't want not really a message. I want kind of an anti-message that things don't go well. So.
Do you agree with Céline here? Is that what you would like it to end with?
In one way, I agree on that. But on the other hand, I think that what Game of Thrones has made so clear is that, I mean, that people, they do cooperate in a way. I mean, it's very chaotic, it's very unpredictable, it's very difficult to predict the future. But still, I mean, Robb Stark is. He's a hero, and he of course he has to die when doing such a stupid thing, that to choose love instead of the interest of the realm. Of course you are to die. Yeah. So.
But isn't that also Jon Snow your typical hero?
Oh yes, very boring.
And I wanted to ask you this, Hans Jacob, because you're a historian. Has there ever been a successful hero conquering something and maintaining power?
There has been a lot of successful heroes, but that is because the history has been written for them.
Yeah.
So, for instance, our first hero in Norwegian history is King Sverre, whom you all know. You sing about him every 17th of May. And for one thing, he was he was not like Bolton. He's not Bolton. He's not that bad. But he's not good. He's not good at all. And the other thing is he doesn't conquer Norway. He never conquers Norway. So history has been written by the victors, and that's why we have a lot of historical heroes. But in their contemporary time, no.
How would you like it to end?
I don't want all to die. I think that's sad, but I agree they might be realistic. But
you really think that will happen?
No, I don't think it's going to happen. No. I don't. But I don't think it's going to be sort of this happy ending with Daenerys and Jon Snow ruling the Seven Kingdoms either, because that's too predictable. So maybe a breakup of the Seven Kingdoms, that might be a good solution.
But Siri, keep the phone, because microphone. Sorry, because I'm not used to doing this in English. Which person is the best politician in this universe? Would you think?
So the person who has the best objectives, or the person who's sort
who plays the game best? Who's the better player?
Cersei is obviously playing the game well at the moment.
Cersei again? I'm disappointed. No,
but I mean she's now in power, but I do think that she will suffer from that at some point.
But she's just crazy and makes
well,
crazy decisions.
There are other people who are crazy who lead countries.
I know, but I wouldn't call them the greatest politicians.
Well, it depends on what their aim is, right? If you're gonna judge someone's how well they're doing, you need to judge them by the goals, right?
Or their means. What do they have to start with, and how far can they go with their means? Well, and she has a lot of power, and she is crazy, and she's done crazy things, and acquired many enemies, and she will. I think she will die. So take my word for it. Yeah, but if you take Tyrion, for example, he's been an outcast, and he has through playing the game, through being intelligent and connecting with the right people. He's networking, obviously. He in my view, he has been a good politician, and he's still playing. He is still influencing the game, and he's got Dany's ear. So how would you consider him?
I think he's sort of the voice of soundness and wisdom in Game of Thrones. He's making good decisions. Despite all his flaws, he's very charismatic. And then, of course, let him win at the end. That is sort of also saying that good can win at the end, I think.
So boring, in other words. Yeah.
Yeah, he has developed quite. I mean, in the beginning, he was just he was not politically correct, but he has become more and more of that.
He was more punk rock in the beginning. Yeah.
But he's, of course, I mean, he is the advisor, so he's always dependent on someone else. And this is really the trouble with all these people, that they can lose everything in just one stroke. So that might happen to him too. I mean, Daenerys once says that never say against me in front of a public. So it's a lot of things that an advisor cannot do.
But imagine that you were Cersei, your favorite. You were her counselor. What would be your counsel for Cersei in order to win?
I think she would be better off without me.
Yeah, maybe
for the first thing. But she is very realistic. I mean, we have we have a guy called Erling Skakke in Norwegian history, who is the main opponent of Sverre. And his son starts to be a little bit like Tommen and says, oh, Papa, can't we give mercy to this and that guy? And then Erling Skakke says to his son, you are not going to rule your country for long if you only show mercy. So she's always highlighting the need to be feared and the need to show violence. But contrary to Joffrey, she's never doing this uncritically. And she's shocked by Joffrey because she sees that he cannot play the game. So she's a very astute politician.
Céline, do you have a favorite character in the show that is still alive?
Yeah. Yeah, I used to have, actually my favorite character used to be Sansa, not based on statistics or anything, but just because I felt she was a realistic character when she didn't do anything, or when she was kind of, some seasons ago where she just was pushed around and had no agency, then she was my favorite. But now she has got more agency and become in a way less realistic as I see it. So
why would you say that?
Or perhaps she's grown and people do that in reality too, but I like that there was a character who kind of show that for most of us in life we don't have so much control of our own lives. So and throughout history also that of course there are some people who try and really have agency of their own lives and end up reaching their goals, but most people don't. And she was a character like that. And there are of course many other examples in Game of Thrones, but she also survived. So that was interesting. She had no agency, but she still managed to keep alive. So she wasn't totally hopeless, but yeah. And then of course I like the pragmatic ones, like Jaime and Tyrion and Baelish, or the kind of the smart ones, but mostly in the previous seasons also. So.
Yeah. Hans Jacob, favorite character? Dead or alive?
I think maybe I got Sansa also now when you said this, because I think that is
old Sansa or new Sansa?
Well, in a way, she's much like a medieval queen, and I won't really be disappointed that she gained some agency, because medieval queens are very important, since they are bridgeheads between different families and different cultures sometimes also. So we have, for instance, in the sources, women are very little mentioned in medieval sources. But we have found out something quite interesting recently. It is that civil war breaks out in Denmark soon after the queen dies. It has got nothing to do with the king, but the queen is married. It's a Danish queen. She is married to the Swede. She's from Sweden. She has been married to a Norwegian, and now she's married to a Dane. And suddenly, and when she dies, it seems like everything becomes more and more violent, and we cannot really tell this from the sources because we don't have them, but it looks like it's her network that has been keeping things going. So that Norway, Sweden, Denmark has been very closely related. Also a lot of king's sons, this struggle between different king's sons in Game of Thrones, that the family is always rivaling. It's very realistic. So Sansa, in a way, she's passive, but in her passivity, she's also got an agency because she's the glue, in a way.
So 2 for Sansa. Siri, favorite?
I think my favorite is Arya.
Arya, okay.
Thanks.
Keep it in the family.
Yes,
yeah.
But I mean,
Why?
She's not realistic, but she has this
list.
She has this list, but she's determined. She wants to do stuff. She wants to get stuff done, and she does. It's kind of a girl power thing. I think she's cool and very not realistic, but I like her.
Yeah. Maybe are there some questions from you guys? We can maybe take 1 or 2. Just yeah.
Hello.
Hi,
Can you
what
hear
is
me?
your name?
I'm Helmer Aslaksen.
Hi.
From Department of Mathematics, University of Oslo. I thought it was very, very interesting talks, all three of them. I have one question, because it was of course natural to compare Games of Thrones with the Wars of the Roses, since that is obviously what it's based on. But I thought it would also be interesting to compare it a little bit with the 100 Years' War. Yeah. Because you see, the 100 Years' War was more a war of terror against civilian population in France, where noblemen were usually were kidnapped for ransom, and mortality there, except for when the French prisoners were murdered at the Battle of Agincourt, mortality among nobility was probably lower. While with War of the Roses was in a sense the aim was to eliminate ticking genealogical time bombs. So there the purpose was often to not kill civilians, but to kill specific people you want to get rid of. So it would be interesting if you had done a Wikipedia study comparing, let's say, France from 1350 to 1450, and see how that would have come out. Because in a sense, you know, it's interesting when I read the Game of Thrones. It's like, is it a terror? I mean, the wars when for instance Rob goes south. Is he trying to terrorize the population, or is he just trying to kill some specific people? That would be interesting to sort of also look at the Game of Thrones book more carefully.
Céline, you had some comments for that?
Yeah, so absolutely. I think, although I had the Wars of the Roses here, Game of Thrones is a mix of very many things, and also specifically kind of a mix of the 100 Years' Wars and the Wars of the Roses, because France in the 100 Years' War was a true feudal state, like the Westeros is, while England was not really. In my view, this is my during the Wars of the Roses, because the kind of feudal structure had more or less broken a bit down, and they already had a parliament. It was more modern than the Game of Thrones universe is in many ways, in my opinion. But yes, I should do it, but it's more difficult because, of course, as you start going backwards in time, there are much fewer Wikipedia articles about specific persons and much less certain dates, or even at all. So I looked a bit on it 3 years ago, and I didn't find so many persons, but yeah, these articles, of course, increase all the time, so I should definitely do that again. And also, there might be other conflicts. There's of course, the 30 Years' War much later in Europe, but that is also more general, much more horrible for civilian war than,
Jacob had some comments also.
Yes, what is interesting also with the 100 Years' War is that it has the same development as in Game of Thrones, because it starts out, I mean, it's feudal or not. France is really what we call in Norwegian a lappeteppe. What is that in English? A mosaic of a lot of more or less independent lords. Yes, right, like Westeros, and where the king's sovereignty is just nominal. And also in Game of Thrones, also in the 100 Years' War, we talk about that as a war between England and France. But the 100 Years' War is much more of a civil war in France, a civil war where it's a war among nobility, as in Westeros, but also a war between nobility and peasants, as I talked about this incident from the 100 Years' War, which is connected probably to the Black Death, which is kind of this catastrophe that could come in the Game of Thrones, because Black Death just takes away all the income of the nobility. And also, of course, because the 100-Year War ends with Jeanne d'Arc, it ends with a lot of armies, a big army, the first standing army in the history of Europe, just as maybe is what's happening now in Game of Thrones.
Very quick, that there's another actually very known inspiration of Game of Thrones is a series of French historical novels about the 100 Years' War, and I have read them, but the title escapes me completely, and also the author, so it's not very helpful. But it's something about iron also in the title, I think. Les Princes de Fer, or something. And it's in English also. Very good novels about. So that is also a possible comparison to actually scrape those novels for all the characters and to see how they go. But it's a longer project.
Thanks. Any other who have questions? We can. I have more, so no problem. Just raise your hand if you suddenly think of something. I have a question for you, actually, Siri. Who would you say has the rightful claim to the Iron Throne in the Five King War?
So if you follow the sort of a king's order, I guess it's Stannis Baratheon who has the claim, but on the other hand, Robert Baratheon took the throne from the Targaryens in a rebellion. So why would they have more claim to the throne than the Targaryens or anyone else who would rebel against the king? I mean, it's not a democracy. They are not elected. So in a way, whoever gains the power, I guess, has the claim to it. Whoever gets to sit on the throne at the end.
Hans Jacob, we talked about and the Lannister Lancaster and the Stark York comparisons are obvious. Are there any other characters in the Game of Thrones universe that are actually more or less based on actual historical figures?
That's. I mean, it's a. Yeah, she's Margaret from Anjou.
What is her?
You have the Kingmaker. It's a lot of people you could draw parallels with, but I think that you have been doing more Wars of the Roses than I have. So
I'm sure there are. I mean, very many things to say about this, and also not only from the Wars of the Roses, but. And everyone is mixed, but the winner of the Wars of the Roses, in a way, the Henry VII, who ended up as king after the Wars of the Roses, he has many parallels, in my view, to Daenerys, and also a bit to Jon Snow. He was, in a way, an illegitimate claim. There was two kind of bastard relations among his, I think, grandfather and great-grandfather on both sides, so he had a very bad claim for the throne. So that is a bit like Jon Snow, but he ended up winning. And in addition, he had the connection to Wales. I don't know. That's the Tudor name comes from Wales. And then there was a whole prophecy in Wales about him being kind of the prophesied savior of Wales. And of course, Wales has a symbol of the dragon. So all this brings our mind to Daenerys. So I think that is also one could mention. But.
There was a question back there. Hi.
So, hi, I'm Vebjørn. First off, I would say you talk about dragons as unrealistic. I think about them as maybe nuclear weapon or something, and one faction makes them, another steals them, and then both have them. But my question is the later seasons. Now we have the White Walkers, who some say are bad, some not. We don't know. I think we're biased toward humans, since that's what we follow. So I don't see the evil, not evil stuff, since I think all the Red Priests and stuff are maybe more evil than the White Walkers. But my question is really, we have a lot of, let's call it civil war in the Seven Kingdoms, and then suddenly we have a huge power, like a conqueror, let's say that. That's the White, and then suddenly all the Seven Kingdoms have to unite in some way. Is there a lot of medieval or a lot of historical situations where a conqueror suddenly comes to a nation where there's been a lot of civil war, and then they suddenly have to collaborate in some way to not get taken over?
Thanks.
yes.
Examples.
For instance, the Vikings. When they come to England, England is separated into many different kingdoms. Mercia has had the upper hand. Now Wessex is on the rise, and the Vikings are probably very important to the rise of Wessex. The same in the Carolingian Empire. there had been a division between the western and the eastern part. The western part is unable to withstand them and gets more and more decentralized and becomes what we call feudal, whereas in the eastern part, the Ottonians are able to drive them back, and also the Magyars, and there you have this, so that gives rise to a consolidated kingdom. We have also very many episodes in... Pardon?
The Crusades and the joining of the states around.
Yeah, it's a lot of examples, and in medieval Norway, one could even say that the situation of, if Norway has problems or not, is very much a consequence of the situation in Denmark. If Denmark is threatening us, for instance, Harald Hårfagre, if Denmark had been as strong as it had been, probably there would have been no Norway. If Knut the Powerful hadn't died in 2035, we might have been Danes, all of us. I mean, we are more Danes than Norwegians. That's a payback to the Dane over there.
Thank you. We had one question here in the front row.
My name's Julie Hansen. I'm a PhD student here at Prio. So one of the things that Game of Thrones has been criticized for is the showing a lot of sexual violence, rape against women. But some responses to that has been that, well, this is reality, this is what's happening in old and new wars. So I'm just interested to hear what your take is on that, comparing the two universes.
Thanks. Is there any mathematical analysis on not just deaths, but also sex in the universe?
Yeah, that would be just very quick.
Sorry.
That would be harder to quantify because I think the sources are much more scarce. The rapes don't show up on Wikipedia, for instance, usually. But for modern words, they do quantify it. So I suppose then it would be natural to turn to more modern situations.
Siri?
So in modern wars, we know that that's used as a weapon of conflict, and especially, for example, in the Congo, the DRC. So in the Game of Thrones, in the first seasons, it seems that sex is used like just to show off, and it's not really violent, a lot of it. But in the later season, it really is more related to the conflict and revenge and weapon. For example, when they have blown up the what do they call it? Thank you. The nun that was torturing, or at least mentally torturing Cersei when she was captive there, Cersei takes her captive, and then the mountain comes in. And I think it's quite obvious that he will rape her. And I think that's one of the ways in which you don't really see in the early season that is used that much as more of a tactic, I think.
Yeah, sorry.
Hi, Lynn Nygaard from Prio. This is more of an observation than a thought, and I've been thinking about this for all of 5 minutes, so it's not really entirely thought through. But when we first onto the gender thing, I had to say I was sort of wanted to make a little yeah but on the comment about Arya not being realistic, because there are a lot of cases historically of women having to pass as men in order to become independent, and this is exactly what she did. The only way that she could slip through the cracks and be in a way safe and not exposed to a lot of the sexualized violence was to become male. And you also see this with Brienne, that was right, that was her name, yeah, where one of the reasons she can be an independent, strong person is because she's incredibly masculine. Whereas a lot of the other women in Games of Thrones, they are there precisely because of the men in their families, either because they're a sister or a wife or something like that. So I haven't really thought about this all the way through, but I just wanted to say Arya's not all that unrealistic.
Okay, so I guess when I was saying unrealistic, I was thinking more of the God without faces thing. Yeah, yeah. No, but I totally agree, and I think the reasons that you say, that's why she's one of my favorites. That she's strong and she stands on her own and she's independent.
I think there are some situations which are quite unlogical when women are guarantees of alliances and they are maltreated. I think that doesn't make very much common sense historically, because it's important when they are part of an alliance that they are treated good. So that kind of violence, I think, is very non-realistic. But in medieval wars, we know very little about it. The sources are very reticent, so we really don't know a lot about it. But from Scandinavia, it seems that wars only very seldom, they very seldom get so terrible that you start doing this, because this is a humiliation of the enemy. And in most Scandinavian civil wars, people know that they will continue to be to have something to do with one another. They are continuing in the same societies afterwards. So to do that kind of things would be very, very a very radical break with what you. Then you must be so certain that you can eliminate your enemy that you can do it without any risk. And normally, you know that you will live with your enemy tomorrow also, and that prevents that kind of attitudes.
We haven't talked about one character that is perhaps difficult for you with your academic approach to assess, but the Night King, the character of the Night King, how do you see him coming from your academic backgrounds first, and maybe as a regular viewers afterwards? What's Céline or?
As I'm kind of alluded to before, I think he's a boring character because there's no obvious agency. Or what kind of goals do White Walkers have? They can't procreate. It doesn't seem like it. They live forever. They have no fun. They just the motivations for all the other characters are usually the protection of loved ones, or mostly actually that, Cersei especially, and sometimes it's power for itself, and that would be perhaps the motivation of the White Walkers. But I think even for those who seek power apparently for themselves, it's still about increasing the wealth and the security of the family. So I think when it comes to humans, our main agency in the world is kind of the protection of our own. And that is what drives the motivation of all non-kind of pathological characters. And the White Walker, it's difficult to understand what kind of motivation they should have. Or if they live forever, why don't they just stay there and in safety? Why? There's been some allusion to that they want to revenge, that they originally were men and that they were transformed to this. But revenge, I don't believe in that as that powerful motivation. It's at least it's very difficult to imagine the kind of motivations of a character that can't die and that lives forever, and so that's why.
Do you share her view?
Yes, I think they are not very realistic at all. When I think.
Agreed.
I have not met anyone.
But an unrealistic character can still be interesting.
What interests me with them is that they are quite reminiscent of Old Norse mythology, because they are quite much like the giants. And in Old Norse mythology, as I said in 2 sentences, the Old Norse mythology creates a big divide between the gods and the giants. But all the stories are about how important the giants are. Odin has to go there to get wisdom, to get mead, to get anything. So the giants are the losers. They are the ones who are important, but who are not acknowledged importance. And I think that the White Walkers, to me, they are maybe that kind of type, that they are more concerned with the religious conceptions than really with real history. And I think also Game of Thrones throws up the whole panoply of religious beliefs. because you have them, and then you have the 7 gods, which I would say is almost like Catholic Christendom, with all the saints that you have to address for anything. And then you have the sparrows, and you have the Lord of Light, who is medieval. Yes.
I think the 7 gods are more like Roman deities, perhaps, or Greek. But
Have you guys heard? There's an interesting theory circulating in the internet that the seven gods are actually one of each are the Starks. So you have the mother, you have the father, you have the I don't recall every one of them, but yeah, the crone, yeah. Yeah, and each is one of the Starks, and that is a fascinating theory I read.
I would just say that medieval Catholicism is not monotheistic. It's only in the name monotheistic, but if you look at what are important to people, it's not God, it's the saints. And the saints are very much like these 7 gods. So the big break there is with the Lord of Light, because there you have really monotheism.
Okay, that's Protestant.
It's Protestant, but it's also Augustinian.
Yeah.
It's the Manichaeism of early Middle Ages, where you have the division into good and evil, and everything here on the earth is evil. That's the devil's work. That's how Christianity starts. But I mean, it could never have succeeded in that way. So what happens after Augustine is that you get more and more saints, thousands of them, and they all start to get their positions, which are quite independent of God's.
But what about the sparrows? You made a comparison to ISIS, right? Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
I think that you should be the one.
Yeah.
If you agree, or maybe it came to.
So it's certainly sort of this using religion to drive the conflict part, because it seems, at least, while there are a lot of different types of religions, beliefs in Game of Thrones, there's really no conflict across. It's not so that if you have that religion, you can't stay with us. It's more if you. So when Jon Snow is pledging the legion to the Night Watch, he said, okay, if you want to pledge to the 7 god, you need to go there and there, but that's fine. But with the Sparrow, and it suddenly religion becomes important in a conflict perspective. But I haven't really thought more about it than that. But if I can say one comment about the Night King as well, it's because I agree with what's been said about sort of it being climate change, but it can also be other unknowns like terrorism or natural catastrophes. So it's kind of, I don't think about the Night King and the White Walkers as having an agency. It's there as an unknown. We don't know we don't know what's going to happen. You have to convince people that it actually exists. It's sort of this thing that we really don't know anything about, which is kind of the same as climate change. So I don't see it as having an agency, because it's hard to compare it to anything, because it's White Walkers.
Thank you. Well, I'm getting significant hints that pizza and beer are on the way. No?
Pizza is 5 minutes delayed. So
Pizza is 5 minutes delayed. Okay. Yeah, you have a question. Yeah. Hi.
I can't help to notice that Bran has not been noticed at all. How do you feel he fits into the whole equation?
The academic equation, or the? Okay, yeah. Do any of you have any views?
I mean, it's a lot of medieval brands who try to predict the future and who are treated as that. I personally think he's extremely boring, maybe more boring than Jon Snow.
Well, he's not boring. He's just he's the worst actor, I think. But when you hire children, that's a gamble. You don't know what kind of actor they will grow into. But well, I don't agree that he's boring, but it is one of my favorite scenes. Where you remember that scene where the Hodor scene, where we finally get to know why it's called Hodor. I think that was a very nice and touching scene with Bran featuring, and also we don't know the full scale of his powers yet, I don't think, and he can play a big part if he only talks. He's just a little too quiet for my taste. He has some very valuable information that he should have been sharing in order to help his brother out, maybe. In my view, Céline or Siri, do you have any views on Bran?
Yeah, well, it's for me. He's part of the kind of, as we've been touching lately, the religious, mythological dimension of the show, and that is for me the least interesting part. As we said many times, I preferred the beginning, and because that actually in the start it was kind of a post-religious society almost. Everyone said right out, magic doesn't exist, there are no dragons. Yeah, they had these gods, but it felt like most of it kind of just a tradition. No one really. It didn't seem that was a very big difference with medieval times, where at least in my impression, it seems that people really believed in religious stuff. But that was not the case in the beginning of Game of Thrones. They didn't seem to really believe in religion or magic or anything. But now, in the later seasons, there is magic and lots of religion happening. So I see those things kind of in parallel. But
I don't think they believed in magic when they were going to fight a fight. Then I think that they knew that, just like in Game of Thrones says that in 9 out of 10 times the biggest army will win. And then they can proceed with religion before and after, but they know that they are not going to fight a superior army.
But how true are the how the battles are portrayed? As you have all these soldiers fighting for their life to the last man, and no one deserts or run out of there. How true is that?
Very untrue.
That's untrue. Yeah.
Oh yes, I mean.
But I would be the first guy leaving. I think.
For one thing, there is very few decisive and big battles in the Middle Ages. Hastings is a very big exception, but that's the only time in the Middle Ages where you have a really conquest.
How many died in Hastings?
The recent number is 7,000. And they have been, I mean, the sources say it's like 200,000. We have a big battle in Oslo here in the year 1200 with Sverre, and it's said that it's 50,000 people who are participating, which would be all people living in the eastern part of Norway. So Steven Pinker, for instance, he thinks that these numbers are to be trusted, but medievalists, they were just, I mean, I mean, for you, Céline, it must have been terrible. I mean, they are not only putting on a little bit more; they are putting times 100, because I mean, all these people, they wanted to get away. I mean, and in Norway, the warfare is so that we have what we call the svinfylking, and the only principle between the svinfylking is that to prevent people from running away from the battle. Therefore, you put all the professional warriors in the end of, and you put the peasants in between, because the peasants, they only want to go home. So when this breaks, all the peasants go home, and that's the advantage with ships, because they cannot swim home. So therefore, the ship battles last a little bit longer, but not that many deaths.
Just a comparison to 7,000 in Hastings, the battle at Blackwater, they say that 20,000 was killed in Game of Thrones. So maybe not so realistic then.
But it was an entire fleet there.
Yes, but also at the Red Wedding, most of Robb Stark's army was killed, and that's about 15,000.
But if we take away the exaggerations, which are similar to the Middle Ages, it becomes more realistic. And Robb Starks, he says that I cannot dissolve my army because I will never be able to gather it again. So he knows, everybody knows that people in this army, they are fighting for themselves. So the only way of catching them is to take them by surprise, which they of course does. But this is bad politics. And that's not very often done when you know that you lose your life from it.
Hi.
Hi. I would like to bring in the aspect of political theory about Thomas Hobbes' stage of nature and the anarchy that's reigning in the Game of Thrones. And after a while, do you think that we will see a development towards more corporations between the actors that are in place, where we now today have a lot of cooperation between the different states? Do you think that we will have more corporations and go away from the anarchy of Hobbes in Game of Thrones and get more development or in corporations?
City, maybe? Or, yeah.
Well, it does seem like that's what they're doing now. That there are more cooperation between sort of Daenerys and Jon Snow and Jaime also going up north to fight the White Walkers.
It's never been an anarchy in my view. It's a civil war, but it's not
Yeah,
an anarchy.
yes, but it's also about what is in that.
That's governing, and that's the Iron Throne. So when the sovereign falls, that's when the state of nature comes to play, and we get the civil war and War of the Five Kings.
Yeah, so if that depends on what you believe is the nature of the people, of humankind. Is it anarchy, like you were alluding to as it in Game of Thrones, or is it really cooperation? And I guess maybe that's what we'll find out, what it really is. But I think anarchy is a good bet.
I think that anarchy and the state of nature has never existed. Never. Maybe in Syria or some places where states have broken down. But this is really the big illusion. And Game of Thrones is so nice because it shows that it's not anarchy. I mean, it's a lot of complexities, a lot of maneuvering, a lot of broken oaths and things like that, but it's not incomprehensible. It's not arbitrary. It's just a very, very complicated and complex political life, which we don't know anymore because we have security for all that. But I mean, when people fall in Game of Thrones, it's because they don't understand the political game. It's not because it's anarchy.
One last question for you.
Hi. When you were talking about Bran, you said that his character wasn't realistic, but I was wondering, because in season 1, after he was paralyzed, how realistic is it that his family would take such good care of him? Because in other series and when you read about history, it's so important to be strong and to not have any weakness in your family. So is it actually realistic that they would take care of him and that he would survive this long? And other characters also that are weak in the Game of Thrones.
There has been a theory that parents in the Middle Ages didn't love their children. It was launched 50 years ago by a historian called Philip Ariès, and that's been refuted 1 million or 2 million times. But it's still, I mean, it's easy to find instances where they love their children. But you are right in the way that medieval parents, they didn't treat their children equally. They didn't have an ideal of that. So if they had one son that were more able, they said, "You are my successor, even if you are not the oldest, even if it's unfair towards the others." So it is, and that is in line with your point that one didn't. That it was more strength was more important, but but it's, yeah, I mean, it's hard to tell. A mother's heart.
Well, I think we'll wrap it up right there. So thanks to Céline Cunen, thanks to Jacob Orning, and thanks to Cyrus Ruslan, and thanks to you. Now it's pizza and beer back there, I think. Yeah, thanks.